jokes and an excuse for me to talk about the Fass and the Serverless movies. So it's your fault for you're stuck in here with me now. But hey, who am I? My name is Simon McDonald. I'm Canadian. One of the two Canadians, I think, that are presenting this time around at Midwest JS. I spend a lot of time traveling around, giving talks at various places. And what I've been trying to do for quite some time now is every time I do a talk, get a picture of the previous talk's intro slides. So I'm just going to hold here for a second for Joel. Thanks, man. I really want it to be like infinite Simons all the way down. I've done a few talks since this one last year that haven't really gotten a good photo, but yeah, that's like me in Hong Kong, and then me in Ottawa, and then me in New Orleans, and then me in Montreal, and it just like keeps going down like about 10 or 12 Simons, which I found that fun. If you haven't figured it out yet, I'm a pretty laid-back presenter, so if you have any questions that you just want to interject at any time, I'm okay with that. You don't really have to wait until the end, so that's fine. And this talk was going to be really different originally. So I was, thinking like I have this Heroku app that I was running on Node.js, and it's, it was costing me money, and it's like, I'm going to write a talk about how to, save money by converting these things over. And then I was at a friend of mine's cottage, and he had all of the Fast and the Furious movies on DVD. And this is what happened. I'm sorry. Yeah, I really had to scratch that itch. I could not stop myself from like grabbing them from him. Still haven't given them back. It's great. Watch them all again. And I just, the whole talk kind of came together on that. So let me give you a heads up. There will be spoilers. Yeah, but it doesn't matter, okay? If you haven't seen all of the Fast and the Furious movies, it doesn't matter. You're not watching those movies for the plot. You want to see explosions. You want to see car chases. You want to see all the crazy stuff they do. I fully believe that these movies are actually bad, but they're so bad that they like kind of break through that horrible movie thing and kind of wrap back around again and become completely awesome. I mean, there are scenes where they jump cars between skyscrapers. It's like, that is stupid, and it is amazing at the same time. So again, there may be some plot points I give away, but it doesn't matter. Whatever. So in case you didn't know, to this date, they have made 8 different Fast and the Furious movies of incredibly different varying levels of quality. Some of them are great, some of them not so much. Some of them are only like tangentially related. Somehow they were able to make, the Tokyo Drift movie and then kind of shoehorn it back into the entire like continuity of all of these films. We still need justice for him, but that's a whole other thing. So just a quick show of hands. Who else here has seen all of the Fast and the Furious movies? Okay, that is a little more than I usually get. I also want to know who hurt you. Why did you feel like you had to do that? Anyway, it's okay. So later on when we're doing the mixer later tonight, just come talk to me. We'll form a support group. We'll get through this all together. But besides the fact that they've done 8 of these movies, they have 2 more on the way. Yeah, Fast 9 and Fast 10 are coming. And then, of course, just released last weekend, I believe, is the Hobbs and Shaw spinoff. So we're going to get a lot more than 10 movies. This at some point in time, this may kind of outnumber the Marvel Cinematic Universe by the time they're done doing all these movies. Now, sadly, I haven't had a chance to see this yet. I was on vacation with my daughter, and then I came down here for this trip. And I was talking to her yesterday, and she said, "Oh, I saw the Hobbs and Shaw movie." And I'm like, how could you do that to me? That is so unfair. So anyway, so now we're about 4 minutes into this talk, and you're probably thinking, what the heck does Fast and the Furious movies have to do with serverless? And again, nothing. I just had the movies, and I decided to kind of shoehorn this metaphor. I'm gonna really punish you with this forced analogy, but maybe we'll learn something. I can't promise that. So let's take a look at the characters in the Fast and the Furious movies. We have Dom. He's the guy. He's doing all the planning for everything. We have Letty. She does a lot of punching, and I swear I wanted to put together a supercut of every time Letty cold cocks some idiot. We don't have enough time. This talk would be an hour and a half if I had to do that, but I would really want to get that up on YouTube someday. We have Tish. He's a mechanic, or at least he starts out as a mechanic. By the time we get to the 8th movie, he's hacking the NSA. I mean, that makes sense. Sure, skill acquisition. It just means that, you can start becoming a developer at any point in your life. You don't have to, start when as your teenage years. You can pick it up later. And then, of course, we have Roman, and he's basically there for comedy relief. And what you may notice about these characters is they have like a single defining trait, something that they do exceptionally well, that they're known for. And that should be the same thing when you're writing a function. So if you have a function, you're going to go off and you're going to fetch some data from a website, then you're going to process that data into, do some processing on it, come back, transform it into another data format that you can then use for your UI. So you don't want those functions to do any more than one thing, because when you start overloading your functions, they start to make a lot less sense. So if we take a look at characters versus JavaScript functions, what do we see? Well, characters should have their own agency. A well-written character shouldn't depend on any other character in the movie in order to exist. When you have those like secondary ancillary characters that are only there in order to get killed to give the main character a motivation for doing whatever they need to do, that's not a very well-rounded character. They don't have their own agency. That's just poor writing. Now, how does that relate to functions? Well, functions should be stateless. They should not depend on anything externally other than what's passed in through their input. So you shouldn't require any kind of global variables or anything like that. Anything that comes into the function should allow it to work. Characters should remain internally consistent. There's nothing worse than a movie that establishes this is how the person acts for 95% of the movie, and then the resolution of the movie depends upon a deus ex machina where the person acts completely opposite to the way they've told you that they act the entire time. That is really annoying. And so for JavaScript functions, they should remain pure. So what that means is every time you give it an input, it should return the same output. So if you give it an A and it returns B, that should be the same case all the time. And there should be no side effects. So it should not change anything in the global state of your application. So the function should remain pure. And then, of course, what I talked about a little earlier, the characters should do like one thing really well. They should have a defining characteristics, and functions should only really do one task per function. Let's not overload them with a bunch of things. All right. So that brings me to the character Brian, that's played by Paul Walker. So how does Brian kind of like connect everything together? Well, it starts off because, Brian is a cop, and he's chasing this car thief played by, it's Vin Diesel. Sorry, wow, his name just went right out of my head. It's just like, he's just Dom to me now. Anyway, he's played by Vin Diesel, and so that's how everything gets started. But then, of course, Brian is also connected to Mia, who is Dom's sister. All right, so that's cool. And then in the second movie, after Brian leaves the police force and he's recruited by the FBI, let that sink in for a second. You're booted off the police force, but then the FBI hire you. That's called failing up, folks. Only a white guy can do that. So basically, in the second movie, Brian is recruited by the FBI to catch some crooks, and he talks to Roman, who's an old friend of his. And then, of course, they pull in Tish, who's the mechanic, which, they're all joining the crew. He's connecting all these people together. We fast forward a whole bunch of movies until, the FBI comes back in it again. And, of course, we have the FBI agent Hobbs, played by The Rock, which just basically everybody in the world will star in a Fast and Furious movie at some point in time. Even you. You're going to get there someday, amazingly enough. So if Brian wasn't part of the FBI at some point in time, we wouldn't get The Rock, we wouldn't break Dom out of jail. It's all of these kind of crazy things. And really what I'm trying to say is Paul Walker is the glue that holds all of these movies together. Sadly, he perished in a car accident, and I think if the folks that have seen all of the movies, you probably agree with me that Fast 8 suffers from the fact that Brian's not in it. There's a little something missing. Not that these are, incredible cinema masterpieces, but what are you going to do? So how does all this relate to function as a service? Well, this is something that I just coined today, in fact, when I was tweaking some of these slides. I called them the Paul Walker patterns. So because Paul Walker connects many of the characters, Paul Walker function and function as a service can do a lot of things like chaining. So when it comes to function as a service, basically that function gets instantiated in its container, all its dependencies are installed, the function runs to completion, and then that container is pulled down. So that's cool, But what if you have to call multiple functions that each input of the function depends upon the output of the previous function? And that's what we have with chaining. So there are patterns that you can do in FAAS that allow you to do that, and thereby you kind of keep that state going from function to function. And another kind of pattern that you see with that is the fan in, fan out method. So one function will get kicked off. It will send off a whole bunch of different parallel tasks, wait for all of those inputs to come back in, and then use that result to call a final function to do things. Now, that's kind of interesting because, again, these functions, when they finish, they should be completely torn down. With a lot of the major function as a service providers, they have different ways of doing this kind of pseudo statefulness. With Azure, it's like the durable functions. If I remember correctly, Lambda has, I think they're the step functions. But there are ways of you kind of keeping this stuff together. All right. Now, getting back over to movies. You know what? I should probably talk slower. I'm a Canadian. I talk really fast. I'm from the East Coast. I am speaking a totally different accent than what I grew up speaking. If I went back to my kind of Gaelic, Scottish pirate accent, you would be totally lost, but that might be funny. But anyway, let me try to slow down a bit here. So the entire team, they can accomplish a lot more together as a team than they can do as a bunch of individuals. And you can think of that as the same way as a bunch of functions, when pulled together, can accomplish a lot more than one individual function can. So, I mean, in the Fast and the Furious movies, they brought down drug lords like multiple times. I feel like they're like, we can't do another movie where we take down a drug lord. We've done that a bunch of times. So, we got to up the kind of stakes a little bit. So, they'll stop rogue secret agents because, again, first movie, they're car thieves. By the 8th movie, they are stopping international terrorists. Again, let that sink in. And, just for the heck of it, they prevented nuclear war that one time. So, yeah, that's great. And so, just like pulling in a team of, kind of diverse individuals, you can accomplish a lot more than you can just by yourself. It's the same thing with functions. As you write these small functions and you compose them together into bigger and bigger applications, you can do a lot more with it. So when it comes to composing functions, we want to make sure that all of our functions, again, do one thing and one thing really well. So if we take a look at this one, which is just basically getting from a legacy API, so we're going to fetch some XML data from a legacy API. And I'm probably showing my age right now by saying XML. Anybody still have to deal with kind of these legacy APIs where you have to get stuff from XML? Yeah, not one person, yeah. Man, you would have not liked the late 90s, early 2000s, because it was all about that. Again, so this function does one thing. It just gets that XML data. And we already have an existing function that formats JSON data in order to display things properly in our UI. All right, so that's great. Now, how would we actually tackle getting that XML data into the JSON format? Would we, create a, perfectly new function that just basically fetches the data from XML and then, changes it into JSON and then does the UI bit? Or can we kind of shoehorn something in the middle that allows us to keep our functions at the way that they are now, because we've been using them for a while. We don't want to have any accidental side effects by changing those functions. As well, they've been really well tested, so we know that they work. We don't really want to mess with that kind of stuff. So what we can do is, between these things, we can just create a new function that allows us to transform from XML into the JSON format. So that's great. Now we have 3 individual functions that do one thing really well, makes them really easy to test, and again, those 2 legacy functions, we already have a bunch of test cases around them, so we know we're not going to screw anything up by changing them. So using some kind of functional programming techniques, what we can actually do is create a new function that just composes all 3 of those functions together. So if you've done any functional programming, you're probably used to Compose. If you're using anything like Lodash, it has some functional programming capabilities as well. But basically what we're doing here is we're taking those 3 functions, we're passing it into another one called Compose, and what that does is it returns us a brand new function that allows us to run all 3 of those things together. So we're building up like more and more capabilities by combining our small functions into one larger function. And then the nice thing about this is it allows you to reuse those smaller functions in lots of different places in your code. Okay. So back to movies. Well, when it comes to plot points, those are the things that are catalysts for actions. That's like the reason that the characters go ahead and do things. So in the Fast and the Furious movies, well, we have a bunch of car thefts. That's really how things kind of like start off, which is great. But also, we've had people get blackmailed. We've had people break out of jail. We've had a number of kidnappings. And then, of course, murders. You can't really have a movie without murders. Again, we still need justice for Han. I'm trying not to say anything until I actually get a chance to see Hobbs and Shaw, but I'm still very confused by Shaw being a good guy now. But anyway, please don't spoil that movie on me, even though I'm spoiling all the other Fast and the Furious movies on you. So that's how action kind of gets started in the movies. Now, in a functional as a service, a serverless side of things, we have a number of events. So events are what kind of kick off the action for us here. Now, it could be something as simple as when you do a git commit. So we're changing some stuff in one of our repositories that kicks off like a build process that eventually gets things deployed for us. There could be any kind of database action, any kind of create, read, update, delete. So imagine you have this order processing system. Somebody creates a new order that's added into your database. That calls function as a service in order to go ahead and create an email that gets sent to the person to let them know that their order is being processed. You can have cron jobs. Again, Canadian, I managed my hockey team on Friday night. Something I realized not too long ago is that every Wednesday I would get up, I would handcraft an email to send out to the guys to say, this is when our game is, let me know if you can't make it, just do all that stuff. And I realized, wait a minute, I can just make that a serverless function and call it using a cron job, which many of the FAASs will allow you to do. So every Wednesday at 2 a.m., this email comes out, and the guys think I'm like up at 2 a.m. just like handcrafting these emails. Now they're like, oh man, you're so dedicated to this. And I'm like, yeah, dedicated, that's right. As well, you have blob storage. So if you have like an S3 bucket, or kind of if you're using like Adobe's Creative Cloud to be able to add a PSD file into your Creative Cloud, you can kind of get events from that. So to say like, oh, hey, we've uploaded a new icon, and it's like, yeah, that's great. Let's have a serverless function go through and create that icon in all the different formats that are needed for iOS and Android, and be able to put up to the App Store. So you can kind of, automate a lot of these things as well. There's analytic triggers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So imagine you have like a visitor on your website. They put something into the cart, but they've never actually done the checkout. So you can actually have an analytic trigger fire off there in order to send them an email like, hey, you want 10% off your order, and maybe get them over that hump in order to be able to buy something. So a lot of these things are catalysts for your function as a server stuff. So that's great. But what about serverless? Okay. I know someone out here in the audience is thinking this right now. Okay, but let's stop that. Let's just like agree all together right now. Let's have a covenant. We will not make that tired old joke anymore. Okay, it's 2019. We're done with that. All right, perfect. I think we're all in agreement. All right, so before we talk more about serverless, I'm going to force another analogy on you. And again, I'm old. I'm so old. I know people still go to the movies to see like a new film, but things have evolved. But I remember a time when the only way you could see a movie, like if I wanted to see Return of the Jedi, I had to go to the theater. I had to beg my parents to drive me to another town to go to the theater and see Return of the Jedi, which I did incessantly. So that was the only way that you're able to see movies at that point in time. But as technology improved, we got the VCRs, which shifted a lot of the viewing of movies to your home. So you had, this home theater, which, your dad probably like built in the basement and didn't let you use it. And anyway, I'm dealing with stuff right now. Okay, memories are coming back. All right, I'll just call my dad later. Okay. So, you had that home theater, you had the ability to like rent VHS tapes, but at that point in time, we still had to schlep our way to Blockbuster or whatever your local video store was in order to be able to rent the movie to watch it. So things are starting to evolve. And then somebody had this great idea that's like, hey, instead of actually going to the movie store, we'll just send you the DVDs in the mail. And it's like, that's kind of how Netflix started. And I was like, that was the beginning of the end for Blockbuster and all your other movie rental places. You know, it's like, you know, talk about disrupting the industry. And then finally, you know, streaming services came along, and now we don't ever actually have to leave the house. I mean, we have Netflix, you know, piping movies directly to our house. Although that's starting to change now, because now you have to have like 18 different streaming services in order to get everything, and I can't wait for Disney Plus to come out and add another $10 to my monthly thing. Why did I ever get rid of cable? So yeah, but now our problem is deciding what to watch. So it's great. All of this stuff evolved along, but that kind of evolution of how we watch movies is kind of mirroring the way we've been writing code for a while. So who here remembers this? All right, we have a couple of people that remember the server closet. I've had some youngins talk to me, and when you say server closet, they think of it as kind of like a metaphor. They don't actually remember the time when it was a server closet, when you had your office building and you would stick all of your servers into a closet that was like poorly ventilated and overheated sometimes. So, you know, that's great. So once upon a time, we did a bunch of this on-prem stuff. And then came along infrastructure as a service. So we can take advantage of a lot of companies to be able to do providing of our servers, our storage, our networking, all that kind of stuff. So that kind of like moved us up the chain. We didn't have to worry about a lot of that infrastructure stuff anymore, which was fantastic. And then beyond that, we got into platform as a service. So things like our operating system, the middleware, maybe a runtime for you, all that's being handled by the platform as a service companies. It made your life even more easier. And then we got on to software as a service. So that was great. We provided all this back end for our customers. We didn't have to worry about a lot of that stuff. So they were taking care of all of that for you. So Heroku was brilliant. I mean, I was like, I need to run a Node app. It's like, I write the code, I push it to Heroku, I've got a Node app up and running. That's great. So, but still at that point in time, we had to do a complete Node application. And that's where function as a service comes in. So instead of having to write a complete Node application, you can just use function as a service in order to create individual functions for your application and run them that way. So these are kind of the four main players in the function as a service space. They're all great. You can pick anyone you want. So basically, we have Azure Cloud Functions, which is the lightning bolt. We have the AWS Lambda, which of course is the Lambda. We have the Google Cloud Functions, and we have IBM's Bluemix. So oddly enough, they're all pretty great, but when it comes to the market share, it's pretty nuts, because Amazon has over 50% of the market share. It's followed by Microsoft, which I think has around 30% last time I checked. Then you're getting into Google, which has 10%, and then IBM's got like 1 or 2. So it's pretty wild how the distribution curve is there. And then of course, which is not pictured here because, you know, we're in North America, is Alibaba. So actually Alibaba is probably got a bigger chunk of the market share than both IBM and Google combined, because they have China completely locked up. So amazingly enough. So that's kind of how we evolved along the same path of like taking movies from the theaters to, you know, getting everything done for us. And the same thing with writing our code. We don't have to, you know, worry about quite so much infrastructure again. But bringing it back to Fast and the Furious, there we go. It's really about a couple of things. It's about the cars. You want to see the cars racing along. And then, of course, those cars need somewhere in order to be able to run, and that's on the roads. So what makes the movies really successful is they can happen anywhere in the world, because cars have, you know, are ubiquitous anywhere we go. And even if they're not, I mean, The Rock can always drive a tank. It's, you know, it's the same concept, really. So would anybody here actually be surprised if, like, in Fast and the Furious, like, maybe 10, it'll maybe take an extra movie or two to get there, that, you know, Dom is driving Optimus Prime in his truck form? I mean, I think at some point in time, the Fast and the Furious movies and the Transformer movies will cross over, and it will be epic. But I honestly wouldn't be surprised. They're going to go to space, I swear, by 10 at least. All right. So what's the difference between Furious and Serverless? Well, in Furious, again, it's about the characters and the cars, so that's great. And on Serverless, well, we have the characters are like the code, those individual functions that we write, and the cars are like the containers. So it's all of the containers that our code runs in. And then, of course, we have the roads, and for that, it's the other folks' infrastructure. So, you don't have to build a road in order to drive somewhere because somebody has already done that for you pretty much across the entire world. So you can take advantage of other folks' infrastructure. And occasionally, you do have toll roads in here in the United States, which is super cool, but at least they don't have a giant ton of potholes in them like Canadian roads do sometimes. Anyway, that's a whole other kettle of fish. And then, of course, as I was saying, the Fast and Furious movies pretty much have infinite possibilities about what they can do because there's really no limit to what's going on. Honestly, I cannot wait to see Hobbs and Shaw because I think that really starts bringing in the sci-fi elements of those movies, so it should be interesting. And then, of course, when it comes to serverless, the infinite possibilities are the unbounded scaling. So you don't really have to worry about how successful your product is. You can just let the serverless providers do the scaling for you. So you don't have to worry about a ton of this stuff. Okay. So why did I start getting interested in this in the first place? Well, yeah, that's a good question. Do you remember back like way earlier in the presentation, I was talking about this initially was going to be a much different idea before I saw those Fast and the Furious DVDs. And basically what happened is I had this app that was running on Heroku, and it was barely used. So it was on the lowest tier that Heroku had, but it was still costing me $7 American. And when you convert that over to Canadian dollars, it's like 400 million a month. Okay, maybe not that much, but it was at least a 30% premium. So it was costing me over $100, $150 a year just to have this application running that I occasionally used when I was doing other presentations. So that's not great. So the Heroku app, again, it's a Node Express application. It was serving up some static assets, the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS, and it really had two routes in it. One was to do translation, because this presentation is actually an example of how to do speech recognition in the browser, and you're probably thinking, why aren't you talking about that? That sounds like way more exciting. And it's like, yeah, well, sorry, maybe tomorrow, if there's an open slot, just tell them you want to hear about that. But basically it did two things. One, you would say something to the application, it would translate it into English or French or Spanish, depending upon how we had it set up. And again, you could ask the app a question, and it would query the Wolfram Alpha API in the web in order to get you the answer for your question. So that was, it was a pretty good presentation. It was an interesting demo, but again, barely used, so it was costing me money for absolutely no reason. So I decided that I should really convert it over to serverless using function as a service. Whoops, wrong button. All right. Yep. So the first thing that I did is I took all those static assets that I had packaged up in the Heroku application, and I pulled them out of the Heroku app and I put them on GitHub. So just using GitHub and GitHub Pages, because it was absolutely free for me, I was able to serve those static assets, and they were still able to call back to the APIs that I was hosting on Heroku. So it's like, first step, everything still works. Great, that's fantastic. So that's awesome. You don't have to particularly use GitHub. You could use an S3 bucket, whatever else you feel like. So the next step is I went in and I took those two APIs that I was using and completely rewrote them. Instead of using Node Express routes, I just rewrote them as functions that could run in the cloud. Now, how did I decide which function as a service to use? Well, it's really simple. I went to my project manager, who is my 14-year-old daughter, and I told her the name of the main 4 things, and she thought Azure was the coolest, so that's the one I used. So, hey, sometimes it's really good to delegate your decision-making to other people. So once I had everything done in a function as a service type of thing, I didn't need the Node Express application anymore. I didn't need Heroku. It was providing me no benefit whatsoever. So I just got rid of that, and now I have like a GitHub pages that calls function as a service APIs when it actually needs to run that. So the bonus with that is there's no more hosting fees whatsoever. So that $7 American, again, American, that I was sending to Heroku every month no longer needed to do that. So if you have something that maybe perhaps is in your company or that you're running personally, that you're just like, whatever, it doesn't cost me that much money, I'll just keep running it on these things. Without too much effort, you convert it over to function as a service, other serverless technologies, and you can get rid of those hosting costs altogether. So it may save you a little money, it may save your company a ton of money. So think of that as an opportunity to kind of look into things. So, all right. Basically, I had the idea for this talk, and then immediately afterwards, I saw a bunch of slides that had come out from Linda Nichols, and she did a really great talk called Not So FAAS, What's Under the Hood, where she, again, also uses Fast and the Furious GIFs all over the place. But, we talked. She's cool. She's like, yeah, go right ahead. You're not copying off me. It's totally different ideas. So, sometimes these things bubble up in different places. All right, so kind of wrapping everything up, and man, I just powered through that. Sorry, folks. The summary is functions should do one thing and one thing only. So everything a function needs should be passed in as the input. So do not rely on global variables. So anytime you give it an input, the function should produce the same output every single time. And using composing multiple functions together, you can build like much more complex actions in order to do things. And you can use like a bunch of different events in order to fire off these sequence or these compose functions in order to accomplish some amazing tasks. And really, take advantage of other people's infrastructure so that you can focus on the code. All right, again, that's actually it. That usually takes me like 40, 45 minutes. I don't know what was in the coffee this morning because I flew through that. Bonus is, you can ask me anything you want about function as a service or any other technologies, or you can like get a half an hour back in your day. It's up to you folks. Yep. Yeah, so I'm going to repeat the question just in case it's not picked up by the mic. But after I got rid of Heroku and the money I was paying them, did I hit the threshold that Azure has in order to start paying money for them? And the answer for that is for this particular project, no. It's rarely used. So its idle time on Heroku was like 99.98% of the year. So even the lowest free tier on Amazon or Azure or anything, I would never hit that for the year. So it's really reduced my hosting cost to $0. Yeah.
What sorts of development tools do you use to set up like a development environment around some of these functions as a service provider?
Yeah, so the question is, what development tools can you use in order to set up the function as a service development environment? If you're using Microsoft Azure, the best choice is Visual Studio or VS Code, the open source application they use for that. There is a plugin for that makes dealing with Azure way easier. You don't have to remember a bunch of arcane Azure commands in order to set up things. You can do a lot of that stuff from the UI. That's super useful. That's basically what I've been using for a while now.
Can I add on that though?
Of course.
When I first started doing serverless, I thought you had to do everything through a GUI, which you do for a lot of them, but most cloud providers have a CLI you can use it for an export. But I still save all my functions in GitHub, I import them up through the CLI, use it like any text editor you want.
Yeah, that's very true. So sorry, you want me to repeat that? Yeah. So yeah, besides the fact that Visual Studio Code gives you a lot of UI capabilities in order to manage your serverless things, they do have a CLI in order to do that as well. And that is the same as any other function as a service provider also have CLIs that allow you to do that. So that way you can do a lot of automation, like scripting of this sort of stuff. But when I'm actually in there coding, I do a lot of just using the UI for that. So, yeah. Sure.
Do you have any suggestions on how to manage a GitHub repository, for example, for your functions?
So do I have any suggestions on how to manage a GitHub repository for the functions? I have to ask a clarifying question, like what challenges do you expect with those?
Since they're all isolated, you just put them all in separate files and then find them in later, or?
Yeah, I think Joel wants
I
to.
have some
Yeah.
suggestions too. I typically group things by like what they do. So like serverless functions kind of group together, and like product stuff kind of group together. Kind of subdivide through that. Yeah, I don't know. Like you would with like normal functions, but you're just grouping them by what they're doing because they should be doing one tiny little thing really well. Very functional, as functional as they possibly can, which makes it easier to split it up. Yeah. I just actually read a blog post yesterday on this. I can post it on Twitter if you're interested.
Yeah, it's a great idea. So to try to repeat for the mic, yeah, breaking them up by different like functional capabilities is a good idea. Most of the providers want you to have a single function in a single file in order to make life a lot easier. I don't find that terribly onerous, but another thing to your question was what other tools? There is the aptly named serverless CLI, which is you can go to serverless.com. That gives you plugins that you can connect to all of the major serverless providers. And they allow you to write multiple functions in one file, and then they'll deploy them as individual actions on the functionality as well. We have some groups at work that are using that with a lot of success as well. So that's another really good tool to look into. Yep.
What's the threshold, do you think, for when you shouldn't use?
What's the threshold for when you shouldn't use functions? It depends upon a number of factors, and for me, is this used a ton of times? And it's like, does this constantly have to be up? I would not take my website and replace it with a serverless function because you kind of want your website to always be available without any kind of delay. Because with serverless functions, you are, basically instantiating them. They have to create the container. They have to install your code. They have to grab any of the npm dependencies if you're using JavaScript, and then you run the function. So that performance hit is usually minimal, but if you're running anything mission critical, you may not want that kind of hit to be for every call that goes into your system. It's really useful, again, when you have things that are not frequently used. It's super useful when you have things that are responding to events when it comes to updates of databases or something that you need to only run once a week. So there are a lot of good things for it. But the other thing is you want to take a look at, because it'll scale infinitely, because they will just charge you infinite amounts of money as well. So you want to keep an eye on how much you're actually spending on serverless functions and kind of take a look, hey, when do we get to that point where it actually makes more sense to keep this running 24/7 instead of using it in serverless functions? But that's kind of a business decision for your organization. Sure.
So for a project that follows more of the traditional, front-end connecting to REST kind of architecture, what would be a good first dive into it? If I wanted to break part of that to a serverless architecture, what would be the first step?
Right. So taking a traditional RESTful-based application and breaking it into serverless, what I would probably do is much along the same lines as what I had there. Depending on how you serve your static assets, whether it's part of a node application or whether it's on a CDN, we'll put that aside for right now. But what I would do is take one of the routes that you have and convert that into a serverless function, see how that works for you, and then have your UI call that serverless function. So besides being triggered by events, they can be triggered directly from HTTP calls as well. So yeah, that's how I would just kind of dip my toe into that. Okay. Well, if there's no more questions, thank you all so much for coming. Hopefully it wasn't terribly boring.